Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. The war room of the Red Keep had seen many councils over the centuries, but none quite like this. Maps of the north covered every surface, marked with red pins showing the last known positions of wildling settlements, and black pins marking places where those settlements had gone silent. The great table that had once hosted discussions of taxes and trade agreements now bore the weight of a different kind of planning. The defense of the realm against an enemy that had been legend just months before. Jon stood at the head of the table, his gray eyes fixed on the map of the wall. 3 more ravens had arrived since his wedding night, each bearing worse news than the last. Entire villages north of the wall had been found empty. Their inhabitants vanished without a trace. The few survivors who made it to Castle Black spoke of shadows moving in the snow, of the dead rising to walk again. "The latest report from Lord Commander Marsh," Tyrion said, breaking the tense silence as he read from a scroll that had arrived that morning. 17 wildling settlements have gone dark in the past fortnight. The few refugees who've made it to the walls speak of unnatural cold, of winter storms that seem to move with purpose. "On the Night's Watch?" Daenerys asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Wouldn't be encouraging. 600 men, maybe 700 if you count the recent recruits." Davos replied grimly, "Spread across 3 castles along a wall that stretches for 300 miles. They're outnumbered, undersupplied, and facing an enemy they barely understand." "An enemy we barely understand," Jon corrected quietly. "The stories, the legends, they tell us the Night King commands an army of the dead, that he can raise the fallen to serve him. But the details, the weaknesses, how to truly defeat him," he shook his head. "We're walking into darkness." Ned Stark leaned forward, his weathered hands flat on the table. "I've lived in the north my entire life, heard the stories from old men and the maesters alike. The long night isn't just a tale to frighten children. It's a warning. The wall wasn't built to keep out wildlings. It was built to keep out something far worse." "And now that something is stirring," Thoros added from his position near the window. The Red Priest had been unusually sober since the wedding, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by grim purpose. "The Lord of Light shows me visions in the flames. Darkness spreading like a tide, the dead walking in numbers beyond counting. This is the war he has been preparing us for." "Then we fight," Daenerys said simply, her violet eyes reflecting the steel that had conquered Slaver's Bay. "We have dragons, we have armies, we have the united strength of the 7 kingdoms, and even beyond. Surely, that's enough to face any enemy." "Is it?" Jon asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "Denny, we're talking about an enemy that's had 8,000 years to prepare, to grow in strength. An enemy that turns our own dead against us. Every man we lose becomes another soldier in their army. Which is why we can't afford to lose." Stannis interjected. He had remained in King's Landing after the wedding, his strategic mind proving invaluable in planning their response to the northern threat. "Every day we delay gives them more time to gather strength, to turn more of the living into their servants." "Stannis is right," Jon said, straightening his decision crystallized in his mind. "We march north, all of us, dragons, armies, every man and woman who can hold a sword. If the wall falls, the realm falls with it." "You're talking about abandoning the capital," Tyrion pointed out. "Leaving King's Landing defenseless while we chase shadows in the snow." "I'm talking about defending the realm where the real threat lies," Jon replied firmly. "What good is holding King's Landing if everyone north of the Neck is dead? What good is the throne if there's no one left alive to rule?" "The boy speaks sense," Davos said, his weathered face thoughtful. "I've sailed northern waters, seen the storms that come down from beyond the wall. There's something unnatural about them, something that makes even seasoned sailors cross themselves and pray to whatever gods they favor." "Then it's decided," Daenerys said, rising from her chair. "We march north within the fortnight. How many men can we muster?" 40,000 from the Crown Lands and Riverlands, Tyrion replied, consulting his notes. "Another 30,000 from the north if we can get word to them in time. The Reach and Dorne have pledged support, but it will take time for their armies to march north." "Time we may not have," Jon said grimly. He moved to the window, looking out over King's Landing's bustling streets. The city continued its daily life, unaware that the very existence of the living world hung in the balance. Send ravens to every lord, every holdfast. Tell them the truth. The dead are coming, and we need every sword, every bow, every man who can stand against the darkness. And if they don't believe, Rensley asked. He had been unusually quiet during the council, his typical wit subdued by the gravity of their situation. Then they'll learn the truth when the dead come for them. Jon replied harshly, but we can't force them to see reason. All we can do is prepare for what's coming and hope it's enough. The council continued for hours, covering logistics, supply lines, and 1,000 details that went into moving armies across hundreds of miles. But as the sun began to set over King's Landing, Jon found his thoughts turning to a promise he had made years ago, when he was still Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. I need to send a message to Castle Black, he said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about supply wagons. A personal message to the Lord Commander. What kind of message? Daenerys asked. A reminder, Jon replied. When the Watch contacted me years ago for help when I was in Essos, I promised that if they ever truly needed help, if the realm itself was threatened, I would come. That promise still stands. He moved to a writing desk and began composing a letter, his words careful and deliberate. To Lord Commander Bowen Marsh and the Brothers of the Night's Watch. The realm has heard your call. We march north with dragons and armies, with fire and steel to stand against the darkness. Hold the wall. We are coming. The North remembers, and the realm stands with you. Jon Targaryen, protector of the realm. As he sealed the letter with black wax and the direwolf sigil, Jon felt the weight of history pressing down on him. How many Lord Commanders had sent similar messages over the centuries? How many had watched the darkness gather beyond the wall and wondered if this time would be the last? The preparations will take time, Daenerys said, reading over his shoulder. Food, weapons, warm clothing for southern troops who've never seen a northern winter. Are you certain we can be ready in a fortnight? We have to be, Jon replied. Every day we delay is another day for the Night King to grow stronger, another chance for the wall to fall before we arrive. Then we'd better get started, Ned said, rising from his chair. I'll send ravens to Winterfell, call the northern banners. If we're marching into the long night, we'll need every advantage we can get. As the council dispersed, each member hurrying to their assigned tasks, Jon found himself alone with Daenerys in the war room. The maps still covered the table, their red and black pins a stark reminder of the threat they faced. Are you afraid? Daenerys asked quietly. Yes, a bit, Jon admitted. Not of dying. I've made peace with that possibility long ago. But of failing. Of watching everything we've built, everyone we've sworn to protect, fall to the darkness. Then we won't fail, Daenerys said firmly. We've faced impossible odds before, and won. We'll do it again. This is different, Jon said, his voice heavy with foreboding. The enemies we've fought before were human, with human weaknesses and motivations. The Night King, he's something else entirely. Ancient, patient, implacable. He's been waiting 8,000 years for this moment. Then he's about to learn what it means to face dragons. Daenerys replied, her eyes flashing with inner fire. Fire and blood. Jon, that's what built the Seven Kingdoms, and that's what will save them. And don't forget that your fire magic has grown stronger over the years, even though I cannot use it, but you are different from me and stronger. If Night King is not human, then you are also beyond the strength a human can have. 3 days later, they stood on the cliffs of Dragonstone, watching their assembled fleet prepare for the journey north. Ships filled the harbor, warships and transports, supply vessels and hospital ships. It was the largest fleet assembled since Aegon's conquest, and it would carry the hopes of the living world into the frozen north. Above them, 4 dragons circled in the evening sky. The Lemurian and Yidurd had grown even larger in recent months, their wingspans now rivaling those of the great dragons of old. Viserion, though smaller, was no less magnificent, his cream and gold scales catching the last rays of sunlight, and smallest among them was Rhaegar. Still small compared to his siblings, but growing stronger each day. 4 dragons, Jon mused, watching them wheel through the darkening sky. Aegon conquered the 7 kingdoms with 3. Aegon was conquering the living, Daenerys replied. We're fighting the dead. We'll need every advantage we can get. A raven arrived as they watched, bearing the black seal of the Night's Watch. Jon broke it open and read quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. What is it? Daenerys asked. The wall, Jon said quietly. Denjen reports that the ancient spells are weakening. The barriers that have held for 8,000 years are beginning to fail. He estimates we have weeks, maybe less, before the Night King can break through. Then we sail tonight, Daenerys said, decisively. No more delays, no more preparations. We take what we have and we go. Jon nodded, looking out over the fleet, one last time. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, lay the wall and the gathering darkness beyond it. The Night King had waited 8,000 years for this moment, gathering his strength, building his army of the dead, but he had never faced dragons before, never confronted the united strength of the Seven Kingdoms. We ended the lions, Jon said quietly, his words carried away by the salt wind. We calmed the stags, but now the dead come. Above them, the 4 dragons cried out in unison, their voices echoing across the water like a challenge to the darkness itself. Their wings blotted out the rising moon, casting shadows that danced across the waves like omens of the war to come. And as their fleet prepared to sail into the frozen north, Jon and Daenerys stood together on the cliffs of Dragonstone, fire and ice united against the coming darkness, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them beyond the wall. The long night was coming, but they would meet it with dragons and steel, with fire and determination. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but they would face the darkness together, as they had always meant to. The dead were coming, but the living would be ready. The ancient stones of Winterfell had witnessed many battles over the centuries, but none like this. As dawn broke over the north, it revealed not the golden light of morning, but a sickly gray pallor that seemed to leach the warmth from the very air. The sky was heavy with unnatural clouds, and snow fell in thick, swirling curtains that obscured the horizon. But through that curtain of white, darker shapes were moving, thousands upon thousands of them, advancing with the inexorable patience of the tide. Jon stood atop Winterfell's highest tower, his breath misting in the frigid air, as he surveyed the approaching army of the dead. Even from this distance, the sight was overwhelming. Whites moved in perfect formation, their decaying forms shambling forward with mechanical precision. Among them strode creatures of nightmare giants, with blue fire burning in their empty sockets, bears and wolves twisted into monstrous parodies of life, and things that had once been men but were now something far worse. How many? Daenerys asked, joining him on the battlements. She wore armor of black steel inlaid with silver, the 3-headed dragon of her house, emblazoned across the breastplate. Sword hung at her side. Jon had insisted she carry Valyrian steel, one of the few weapons that could truly harm the others. Too many to count, Jon replied grimly. 50,000, maybe more, and that's just what we can see through the snow. Below them, the courtyard of Winterfell buzzed with frantic activity. Soldiers checked their weapons and armor, while servants hurried to distribute the last of the hot meals before the battle began. The smell of fear was thick in the air, but so was determination. These men and women knew what they faced, and they had chosen to stand and fight rather than flee. The wildfire? Daenerys asked. Ready, Jon confirmed. Tyrion's alchemists have been working through the night. We have enough to turn the entire field into a sea of green flame. But, he paused, his gray eyes troubled. It's a desperate gambit. If the wind shifts, if the flames spread to our own lines, then we burn with them, Daenerys finished. But at least we take some of the dead with us. A horn sounded from the walls, 3 long blasts that echoed across the snow-covered landscape. The signal they had been waiting for. The army of the dead had reached the outer perimeter, where the first of their defenses waited. Jon closed his eyes and reached out with senses to his fire magic. He was still learning to understand. The fire magic responded to his call, and he could feel every torch, every brazier, every flame within miles of Winterfell. It was intoxicating and terrifying, in equal measure. All that power at his fingertips waiting to be unleashed. It's time, he said, opening his eyes. Signal the dragons. Daenerys raised a horn to her lips, and blew a series of complex notes, the ancient Valyrian commands that would call their children to war. The response was immediate and thunderous. 4 roars split the air as Balerion, Gyrrit, Rhaegal, and Viserion rose from where they had been resting in Winterfell's godswood. They climbed into the gray sky like living flames, their scales gleaming even in the dim light. Rhaegarys, Daenerys whispered, and though the dragons were too far away to hear her voice, they seemed to understand. Balerion led the charge, diving toward the advancing army with his jaws already glowing with inner fire. The first gout of dragon flame struck the front ranks of whites like a hammer blow from the gods themselves. Bodies that had been preserved by unnatural cold burst into flame, their ancient bones cracking and splintering in the intense heat. But even as dozens fell, hundreds more pressed forward, trampling the burning remains of their fallen comrades, without hesitation. "Now!" Jon shouted, and across the battlefield, his signal was repeated by horn and banner. The first phase of their defense began. Hidden beneath the snow, carefully placed caches of wildfire erupted in brilliant green flames. Tyrion's alchemists had worked for days to position them perfectly, creating a network of destruction that would channel the enemy into killing fields. The explosions sent pillars of emerald fire reaching toward the sky, and the screams of burning whites filled the air like the wails of the damned. But Jon wasn't content to let the wildfire burn on its own. Reaching out with his magical abilities, he began to feed power into the flames, making them burn hotter and spread further than any natural fire could. The green flames turned white-hot at their centers, and the heat was so intense that snow vaporized instantly wherever they touched. By the 7, Tyrion breathed from his position on the walls. "I've seen wildfire before, but this is something else entirely." The Lord of Casterly Rock was right. What had begun as carefully controlled explosions was becoming something far more destructive. Jon's power flowed into the flames like oil onto a fire, and the wildfire began to spread in patterns that defied natural law. Streams of green fire raced across the battlefield like living serpents, seeking out concentrations of whites and consuming them utterly. For a moment, it seemed as though the strategy might work. The front ranks of the army of the dead were being decimated, their numbers reduced by thousands with each passing minute. The dragons added their own flames to the inferno, strafing runs that turned entire sections of the battlefield into furnaces of destruction. But then the wind began to change. Jon felt it first, as a shift in the magical currents that flowed around the battlefield. The unnatural cold that preceded the army of the dead was pushing back against his flames, creating downdrafts and wind shears that began to redirect the wildfire in dangerous directions. "The flames are shifting," Davos shouted from his position, coordinating the archers. "They're moving toward our own lines." Jon gritted his teeth and poured more power into controlling the fire, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. Whatever force commanded the army of the dead was actively working against him, turning his own weapon into a threat to his allies. "Pull back the front lines," he ordered. "Get them behind the second defensive wall." Horns sounded the retreat, and the living soldiers began to fall back in good order. But even as they moved, Jon could see that the wildfire was only the beginning of their problems. Through the smoke and flames, shapes were moving. Shapes that walked through the green fire as though it were nothing more than morning mist. White Walkers. The others emerged from the inferno, like nightmares made manifest. Tall and gaunt, with skin like pale ice and eyes that burned with cold blue fire, they moved with inhuman grace through flames that should have reduced them to ash. Their armor seemed to be made of ice itself, and the ancient swords they carried gleamed with their own inner light. "They're not burning," Daenerys said, her voice tight with disbelief. "The wildfire isn't touching them." "They're creatures of ice and winter," Jon replied, his own voice grim. "Fire may destroy their servants, but the masters—" He shook his head. "We need a different strategy." But, even as he spoke, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The White Walkers were advancing through the flames, and wherever they passed, the wildfire began to die, not gradually, as any normal fire would when deprived of fuel, but instantly, as though the very presence of the others was anathema to flame itself. "The dragons," Daenerys said urgently. "They need to target the White Walkers directly." She raised her horn again, blowing the complex series of notes that would direct the dragons to new targets. But as Berion banked toward the nearest White Walker, something impossible happened. The creature raised its sword, a blade of ice that seemed to drink in the light around it, and pointed it directly at the approaching dragon. Balerion's flames, which had been incinerating whites by the hundreds, struck the White Walker, and simply stopped. The dragon fire parted around the creature like water around a stone, leaving it completely unharmed. "No," Daenerys whispered. "That's impossible. Nothing can withstand dragon fire. Nothing." But the evidence was right before their eyes. The White Walker lowered its sword and continued its advance, completely unaffected by flames that could melt stone and steel. Around it, the wildfire continued to die, leaving only smoking craters where moments before there had been walls of green flame. "They're adapting," Jon realized with growing horror. "Learning from our attacks, the Night King isn't just commanding them. He's thinking, planning, countering our every move." As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed across the battlefield. A horn blast that seemed to come from the very heart of winter itself. It was answered by dozens of other horns, their mournful notes weaving together into a symphony of despair that chilled the blood of every living creature within miles. And then he appeared. The Night King rode through the dying flames on a horse that had once been white but was now the color of old bone. He was taller than his White Walker lieutenants, his armor more elaborate, his crown a twisted circlet of black ice, but it was his eyes that drew the attention. Not the cold blue fire of his servants, but something deeper and more terrible. Ancient intelligence looked out from those eyes, along with a hatred so profound it seemed to have weight of its own. "There," Jon breathed, "the source of it all." The Night King's gaze swept across the battlefield, taking in the scattered flames, the retreating human forces, the dragons circling overhead. When his eyes fixed on Winterfell's towers, Jon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two commanders stared at each other across the smoke-filled battlefield. Then the Night King raised his hand, and the temperature plummeted. The remaining wildfire didn't just die, it froze. Green flames turned to emerald ice in the space of a heartbeat, creating twisted sculptures that gleamed like jewels in the gray light. The very air seemed to crystallize, and frost began to form on every surface within sight. "Fall back!" Jon shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden, unnatural silence. "All forces, fall back to the castle." But even as his army began its retreat, Jon knew that the real battle was just beginning. The wildfire had bought them time and reduced the enemy's numbers, but it hadn't broken them. If anything, the display of the Night King's power had only demonstrated how outmatched they truly were. The siege engines Tyrion called out as he coordinated the retreat. "We still have the catapults and ballistae loaded with dragon glass. Use them," Jon ordered. "Target the White Walkers specifically. If fire won't stop them, maybe dragon glass will." The great siege engines that lined Winterfell's walls began to loose their deadly cargo. Massive bolts, tipped with obsidian arrowheads, and stone balls, filled with dragon glass shards, arced through the air toward the advancing others. But even here, the Night King's influence was felt. Winds that had no natural source deflected many of the projectiles, and those that found their targets often struck armor that seemed designed specifically to turn aside such attacks. Still, some found their mark. Jon watched with grim satisfaction as one of the White Walkers took a dragon glass bolt through the chest and shattered like a sculpture of ice, its destruction sending ripples of confusion through the ranks of whites it had been commanding. But for every other that fell, 10 more seemed to take its place. "We need to get closer," Daenerys said, her hand on the hilt of Longclaw. "The dragons, the siege engines, they're not enough. We need to engage them directly." "No," Jon said firmly. "That's what he wants. The Night King is trying to draw us out, to make us fight on his terms. We stay behind the walls, use every advantage we have." But even as he spoke, Jon could see that their advantages were rapidly disappearing. The army of the dead had reached Winterfell's outer walls, and the Whites were beginning to climb. Not with ladders or siege towers, but with their bare hands, their fingers finding purchase in cracks between stones that no living man could have used. "Archers," Davos commanded, "loose at will." Thousands of arrows filled the air, most tipped with dragon glass or set ablaze with oil. They found their targets among the climbing Whites, sending dozens tumbling back to the ground. But for every one that fell, 2 more took its place, and the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. Jon reached out with his power again, this time focusing on the torches and braziers that lined the castle walls. He fed his strength into them, making them burn brighter and hotter than any normal flame. Soldiers grabbed the enhanced torches and thrust them at the climbing Whites, and wherever the flames touched, ancient flesh burst into fire. But the effort was taking its toll. Jon could feel his strength draining away with each flame he empowered, each fire he fed with his own life force. The magic was intoxicating, but it came at a cost, and he was beginning to understand why so few had mastered it over the centuries. "Done," Daenerys said urgently, You're pushing too hard. I can see it in your face. This is burning you out. She was right. Jon could feel the fire magic consuming him from within, demanding more and more of his strength with each passing moment. But what choice did he have? Without his power to enhance their defenses, the castle would fall within the hour. I can handle it, he said through gritted teeth, pouring more energy into a brazier that had begun to dim. We just need to hold until... His words were cut off by a sound that chilled every heart within Winterfell's walls. The crash of the main gate giving way. The ancient oak and iron barrier, which had withstood sieges for centuries, splintered like kindling under the assault of a giant wight whose massive fists struck with the force of battering rams. They're through, someone screamed, and suddenly the courtyard was filled with the sounds of battle as wights poured through the breach. Jon drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel blade, singing as it cleared its sheath. Around him, the defenders of Winterfell prepared for the fight of their lives. But even as they formed their battle lines, Jon couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting a losing battle. The Night King had walked through their wildfire untouched. He had turned their own flames against them with a gesture, and now his army was inside the castle, where their advantages of walls and siege engines meant nothing. But there was one advantage they still possessed, one weapon the Night King had never faced before. Daenerys, Jon said, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle. The dragons. Bring them down into the courtyard. That's madness, she replied. In such a confined space, they could hit our own people. Trust me, Jon said, and there was something in his voice that made her nod without further argument. She raised her horn and blew a series of sharp, urgent notes. The response was immediate. Baptagrinen's roar echoed across the battlefield as the great black dragon banked toward the castle. Behind him came his brothers, their wings casting shadows across the snow-covered stones. But as the dragons descended toward Winterfell's courtyard, the Night King raised his hand again. This time, the cold that emanated from him was so intense that frost began to form on the dragon's scales. Varian faltered in his flight, his wings struggling against air that had become thick as syrup. He's trying to ground them, Jon realized, using the cold to make it impossible for them to fly. It was a brilliant strategy, and one that showed just how intelligent their enemy truly was. Dragons were creatures of fire and heat. In the extreme cold the Night King could generate, they would be as helpless as any other beast. But Jon had one more card to play. Reaching deep within himself, he called upon every reserve of power he possessed. Not just the fire magic he had been using throughout the battle, but something deeper. The dragon blood that flowed in his veins, the ancient connection between Targaryen and dragon that existed for centuries. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The dragon's flames, which had been dimming in the supernatural cold, suddenly blazed brighter than ever before. But more than that, Jon could feel his consciousness touching theirs, could sense their thoughts and emotions as clearly as his own. Through Balerian's eyes, he saw the battlefield from above. Through Ygrette's senses, he felt the bitter cold trying to drag them down. Through Varian's mind, he experienced the rage and defiance that burned in every dragon's heart. And through young Rhaegar, he felt something else. A connection to the ancient magic that had once ruled the world, a power that predated the Night King and his army of the dead. Now, Jon whispered, and 4 dragons roared as one. What happened next would be remembered in songs for 1,000 years, if anyone survived to sing them. The dragons didn't just breathe fire, they became fire. Their very beings transformed into living weapons of destruction. Rhaegar, the smallest of the 4, led the charge, his flames burning with such intensity that they turned the falling snow to steam before it could touch the ground. The wights in the courtyard didn't just burn, they were vaporized, reduced to ash and memory in the space of a heartbeat. Even the White Walkers who had walked through wildfire untouched staggered back from this new assault. Their ice armor began to crack and steam, and for the first time since the battle began, Jon saw something that might have been fear in their cold blue eyes. But the effort was costing him everything. Jon could feel his life force flowing out of him like water from a broken dam, feeding the dragon's flames with his own essence. His vision began to blur, and he had to grip the battlements to keep from falling. Jon! Daenerys caught him as he swayed, her violet eyes wide with concern. You have to stop. You're killing yourself. Not yet, Jon gasped, forcing himself to remain conscious. One more push. He reached out through his connection to the dragons, guiding their flames with precision that no rider had ever achieved before. The Daenerys' fire carved through the ranks of whites like a sword through silk, while Geradot's flames created a wall of heat that the White Walkers couldn't cross. Redicol and Viserion worked in perfect coordination, their combined assault driving the enemy back toward the broken gate. For a moment it seemed as though they might actually win. The courtyard was clearing of enemies, and the surviving defenders were rallying behind their dragons. But then Jon felt something that made his blood run cold. Another presence touching his mind, vast and ancient and utterly malevolent. The Night King had entered the battle personally. Through the smoke and flames, Jon saw him walking across the courtyard with the same unhurried pace he had shown on the battlefield. The dragon fire parted around him like water, and where his feet touched the ground, ice spread in crystalline patterns that seemed to sing with their own deadly music. Impossible, Daenerys breathed. Nothing can walk through dragon fire. Nothing. But the Night King wasn't just walking through it. He was absorbing it, drawing the heat and energy into himself, and transforming it into something else. The flames that touched him didn't die, as they had with the wildfire. Instead, they changed, becoming cold fire that burned with blue light instead of red. He's not just immune to fire, Jon realized with growing horror. He's turning it against us. The transformed flames began to spread, racing across the courtyard like a living thing. Where they touched the defenders, men screamed and fell, their bodies flash-frozen even as they burned. It was a contradiction that should have been impossible, but the Night King's power made it real. "We have to retreat," Daenerys said urgently. "Get everyone back into the keep. Seal the doors." "No," Jon said, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying absolute conviction. "This ends here, one way or another." He released his hold on the dragons, letting them return to their natural state, and instead focused all his remaining power inward. The fire magic that had been flowing outward reversed its course, building within him like pressure in a sealed vessel. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, but it was the only chance they had. "What are you doing?" Daenerys demanded. "What I should have done from the beginning," Jon replied, drawing Longclaw with hands that shook from exhaustion, fighting fire with fire. The Night King had reached the center of the courtyard now, his cold blue flames spreading in all directions. The few remaining defenders were falling back, their weapons useless against an enemy that could turn their own fire against them. But as the ancient creature raised his ice sword in what might have been a gesture of triumph, Jon stepped forward to meet him. "Jon, no!" Daenerys tried to grab his arm, but he was already moving, walking down the steps from the battlements with Longclaw held ready. The Night King turned to face him, and for the second time that day the two commanders locked eyes. But this time, Jon didn't flinch. The fire magic burning within him was reaching critical mass, and he could feel it changing him, transforming him into something more than human. "You want fire?" Jon said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtyard. "Let me show you what fire really means." He raised Longclaw, and the Valyrian steel blade burst into flame. Not the red-orange fire of normal combustion, but something pure white fire that seemed to burn with the light of stars themselves. The Night King's cold flames recoiled from it, unable to corrupt or transform this new source of power. The Night King tilted his head, and Jon could almost sense curiosity in that ancient gaze. Here was something new, something the creature had never encountered in 8,000 years of existence. For the first time since awakening from his long slumber, the Night King faced an opponent who might actually pose a threat. The ice sword came up to meet Longclaw, and when the two blades touched, the world exploded into light and sound. Fire and ice met in a collision that sent shockwaves racing across the courtyard, shattering windows and cracking stone. The Night King staggered back, his perfect composure finally broken, while Jon fell to one knee, the effort of maintaining the white fire nearly overwhelming him. But he had proven something important. The Night King could be hurt. The ancient creature wasn't invincible, wasn't beyond the reach of mortal weapons. There was hope, however slim. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since it began, Jon allowed himself to believe they might actually have a chance. The Night King straightened, his ice sword reforming where Longclaw's fire had damaged it. Around them, the courtyard had become a wasteland of ice and flame, where the laws of nature bent and twisted under the pressure of opposing magics. But in the center of it all, two figures faced each other, fire and ice, life and death, the future of the world balanced on the edge of their blades. The real battle was just beginning. The courtyard of Winterfell had become a realm unto itself, where the fundamental forces of creation warred against the void of extinction. Steam rose in billowing clouds where fire met ice, and the very air crackled with energies that had not been unleashed since the dawn of the world. At the center of this maelstrom, two figures circled each other with the patience of apex predators, each seeking the perfect moment to strike. Jon felt the white fire coursing through Longclaw's blade like molten silver in his veins. The Valyrian steel had become something more than metal. It was an extension of his will, a conduit for power that threatened to consume him even as it made him stronger than any mortal man had a right to be. Every heartbeat sent waves of agony through his body as the fire magic burned away pieces of his life force, but he held on, knowing that to falter now would mean the death of everything he had sworn to protect. The Night King studied him with those ancient blue eyes, and Jon could sense a terrible intelligence at work behind that frozen visage. This was no mindless creature driven by hunger or rage. This was a being of vast cunning and patience, one who had spent millennia perfecting the art of war. The ice sword in his hands seemed to drink in the light around it, creating a zone of absolute cold that made the very air shimmer with frost crystals. "You burn yourself alive, little flame," the Night King spoke, his voice like the crack of glaciers breaking apart. The words came not through his mouth, but directly into Jon's mind, carrying with them the weight of eons. "I have watched 1,000 heroes consume themselves in fire, thinking it would make them strong enough to face me. Their ashes fertilized the frozen ground beyond the wall." Jon didn't waste breath on a reply. Instead, he lunged forward, Longclaw's burning blade carving a rake of white fire through the air. The Night King's ice sword came up to meet it, and when the two weapons clashed, the sound was like thunder and breaking glass combined. Sparks of conflicting energy scattered across the courtyard, each one carrying enough power to kill a normal man. The force of the impact drove both combatants back, but Jon recovered first, pressing his advantage with a series of rapid strikes that would have overwhelmed any mortal swordsman. The Night King parried each blow with inhuman precision, his ice blade leaving trails of frost in the air as it moved. Where the weapons met, reality itself seemed to strain under the pressure of opposing forces. Around them, the battle raged on with desperate intensity. Daenerys had taken command of the remaining defenders, her voice cutting through the chaos as she directed archers to target the White Walkers, still advancing through the breach. The dragons circled overhead, their flames creating pockets of safety in the sea of death that surrounded Winterfell. But Jon could sense that their strength was fading. The supernatural cold emanating from the Night King was sapping their power just as surely as the fire magic was draining his own life. "Darien," Daenerys called out, pointing toward a group of White Walkers who were systematically cutting down the defenders near the armory. "Drakar." The great black dragon responded with a gout of flame that should have reduced the others to ash, but as the fire struck them, something impossible happened. The flames seemed to freeze in mid-air, transforming into crystalline sculptures of fire that retained their shape but lost all their heat. The White Walkers walked through these frozen flames unharmed, their ice swords cutting down defenders who had thought themselves safe behind walls of dragon fire. "He's learning," Jon realized with growing horror, even as he ducked under a swing from the Night King's blade that would have taken his head off. "Adapting to our attacks in real time." The Night King's response was a thrust that Jon barely managed to deflect, the ice sword's point passing close enough to his throat to leave a line of frost on his skin. "I have had 8,000 years to study the nature of fire, young dragon. Did you think your flames were something new under the sun?" Jon spun away from another attack, using the momentum to bring Longclaw around in a horizontal slash aimed at the Night King's midsection. The burning blade connected, and for a moment Jon felt a surge of triumph as the white fire bit deep into the creature's ice armor. Steam erupted from the wound, and the Night King actually staggered, his perfect composure cracking for the first time. But the victory was short-lived. Even as Jon watched, the damaged armor began to reform, ice crystals growing like living things to seal the breach. The Night King's wound closed as though it had never existed, and those terrible blue eyes fixed on Jon with something that might have been amusement. "Fire can hurt me, little flame, but it cannot destroy me. I am winter itself, eternal, patient beyond your comprehension. You may burn bright, but all fires eventually die. Just like another tyrant, a sweet purple potato in another universe, a diode came out of its mouth. I am inevitable." The Night King raised his free hand, and the temperature in the courtyard plummeted even further. Frost began to form on Jon's armor despite the heat radiating from his burning sword, and his breath came in sharp puffs of vapor that crystallized almost instantly. But worse than the cold was what came next. The sound of cracking ice and grinding stone as something massive began to rise from the frozen ground. Spears of ice, each one the size of a tree trunk, erupted from the courtyard's stones with explosive force. They shot upward like the fangs of some primordial beast, forcing Jon to leap and roll to avoid being impaled. The spears continued to grow, creating a forest of crystalline death that divided the battlefield and separated Jon from his allies. "Jon," Daenerys' voice carried across the maze of ice, but she might as well have been on the other side of the world. The spears were too tall to climb over and too thick to break through, and Jon could sense more of them growing with each passing second. But the ice spears were only the beginning of the Night King's assault. As Jon struggled to navigate the crystalline maze, he heard a sound that chilled his blood, the groaning and cracking of bones knitting themselves back together. Through gaps in the ice forest, he could see the impossible happening in the courtyard beyond. The dead were rising again. Not just the whites that had fallen in the initial assault, but the defenders who had died fighting them. Men who had stood beside Jon just minutes before were now climbing to their feet with blue fire burning in their empty sockets, their weapons turned against their former comrades. Even worse, some of them were rising from the very heart of the wildfire fields that still burned beyond the castle walls. Flames that should have reduced them to ash were somehow preserving their forms, allowing the Night King's power to reach them even in death. "No," Jon whispered, watching in horror as Roderick Castle, who had fallen defending the gate, rose with his sword in hand and began cutting down the men he had trained since childhood. "This isn't possible. Fire destroys the dead. It's supposed to destroy them." "Fire destroys flesh," the Night King replied, his voice echoing strangely among the ice spears. "But I do not raise flesh, little flame. I raise the essence beneath the spark of will that once animated these forms. That spark burns eternal, and even your flames cannot touch it." The revelation hit Jon like a physical blow. Everything they thought they knew about fighting the dead was wrong. The dragging glass weapons, the fire, the careful preparations, all of it was based on the assumption that the Night King's power worked like the magic of lesser necromancers. But this creature was something far more ancient and terrible, something that operated on principles beyond mortal understanding. A sound like breaking glass drew Jon's attention back to his immediate surroundings. One of the ice spears near him was beginning to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like a spider's web. For a moment he thought it might be the heat from his sword causing the damage, but then he realized the truth. The Night King was reshaping his trap, opening new paths through the maze while closing others. Jon ran, following a corridor between the spears that led deeper into the crystalline forest. Behind him, he could hear the Night King's measured footsteps, never hurrying but never falling behind. The creature was hurting him, Jon realized, driving him towards some predetermined destination, where the final confrontation would take place on the Night King's terms. The corridor opened into a circular clearing at the heart of the ice maze, and Jon found himself standing in what could only be described as a throne room made of winter itself. Pillars of ice rose toward the gray sky, their surfaces carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the space stood a throne carved from a single massive icicle, its crystalline surface reflecting the light of Jon's burning sword in fractal patterns that seemed to extend into infinity. "Welcome to my court, young dragon," the Night King said as he emerged from the maze behind Jon. "Here, in the heart of winter, we shall finish what your ancestors began so long ago." "My ancestors?" Jon turned to face his enemy, Longclaw held ready despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "What are you talking about?" The Night King's laugh was like the sound of wind through empty tombs. "Did they never tell you the truth of your bloodline? The real reason why dragons and ice have warred for so long?" He raised his sword, and the ice throne began to glow with cold light. "Your ancestor Aegon, the Conqueror, was not the first Targaryen to face the Long Night. That honor belongs to another, one whose name has been forgotten by history, but whose failure doomed the world to this eternal cycle." Jon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling the clearing. "You're lying." "Am I?" The Night King began to circle him, his eyes soared, leaving trails of frost in the air. 8,000 years ago, when the first long night fell, there was a Targaryen who rode the greatest dragon ever born. He came north with fire and fury, promising to end the darkness forever. He failed. As you will fail, and in his failure, he taught me the true nature of dragon fire. The Night King struck without warning, his ice blade moving with inhuman speed. Jon barely managed to get Longclaw up in time to block, but the force of the blow drove him to his knees. The white fire surrounding his sword flickered and dimmed as the Night King's cold pressed against it like a physical weight. Fire and ice are not opposites, little flame. The Night King continued, pressing his attack with a series of strikes that forced Jon to give ground. They are two faces of the same power, creation and destruction, life and death, order and chaos. Your ancestor learned this truth too late, and it cost him everything. Jon rolled away from a thrust that would have pierced his heart, coming up in a crouch with Longclaw held defensively. The white fire was growing weaker with each exchange, and he could feel his life force ebbing away like water from a cracked vessel. But even as his strength failed, his mind raced, trying to understand what the Night King was telling him. The first long night, he gasped, dodging another attack. It didn't end because the Night King was defeated. It ended because I chose to let it end, the Night King finished. Because I learned what I needed to learn from your ancestors' failure. The secret of dragon fire, the true nature of the power that flows in Targaryen veins. I have been waiting 8,000 years for another dragon to come north. Another chance to complete what I began so long ago. The ice sword came down in an overhead strike that Jon caught on Longclaw's blade, but the impact drove him to one knee again. The Night King loomed over him, those ancient blue eyes burning with cold fire. You feel it, don't you? The creature whispered. The fire consuming you from within, burning away everything that makes you human. That is the true curse of dragon blood. The power that seems like a gift but is actually a trap. The more you use it, the less of yourself remains. Until finally, the Night King gestured, and Jon saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Carved into the ice throne were figures, human figures, but twisted and changed, their faces locked in eternal screams. And at the center of the throne, larger than the rest, was a figure with distinctly Targaryen features, his mouth open in a silent cry of anguish. Until finally you become like me, the Night King finished. A creature of pure power, stripped of everything that once made you mortal. Your ancestor's dragon still flies beyond the wall, little flame, but it is no longer a creature of fire. It has become something else, something that serves winter instead of flame. Jon's vision blurred as the implications hit him. The fire magic he had been using so freely, the power that had made him feel godlike, it wasn't making him stronger. It was transforming him, burning away his humanity piece by piece, until nothing would remain but raw magical force, shaped by an implacable will. No, he whispered, but even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of it. The fire burning within him was different now, colder somehow despite its intensity. His thoughts were becoming clearer, more focused, but also more distant from human concerns. The faces of his friends and family were growing harder to remember, their voices fading like echoes in a vast cavern. Yes, the Night King said, raising his sword for what would surely be the killing blow. Embrace it, young dragon. Let the fire consume the last of your mortality, and take your place at my side. Together we will bring the long night to every corner of the world, until all things bow before the eternal winter. But as the ice sword descended toward Jon's heart, something unexpected happened. The white fire surrounding Longclaw suddenly blazed brighter than ever before, not with the cold flame of pure magic, but with something warmer, more human. Images flashed through Jon's mind, Daenerys' smile on their wedding day, Ned's proud nod when Jon had been named protector of the realm, the faces of the men and women who had followed him into this battle, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. I am not my ancestor, Jon said, his voice growing stronger with each word. And I am not you. He surged to his feet, Longclaw's blade meeting the Night King's sword in a clash that sent shock waves racing through the ice throne room. But this time the white fire didn't waver or dim. Instead it burned with renewed intensity, fed not by Jon's life force but by something deeper. His connections to the living world, his love for the people he had sworn to protect, his refusal to surrender his humanity no matter the cost. The Night King staggered back, his perfect composure finally cracking. Impossible, he hissed. The fire should be consuming you, transforming you. You should be mine by now. Fire doesn't just destroy, Jon replied, pressing his attack with renewed vigor. It also creates, nurtures, protects. You've spent so long studying its destructive power that you've forgotten its true nature. Longclaw's burning blade found its mark, carving a deep gash across the Night King's chest. This time, the wound didn't heal immediately. The white fire clung to the ice armor like a living thing, preventing the creature's regeneration. The Night King's scream of rage and pain echoed through the throne room, causing several of the ice pillars to crack and splinter. But even as Jon pressed his advantage, he could sense that the battle was far from over. The Night King was ancient and cunning, and this was merely the first exchange in what would be a war of attrition. Around them, the sounds of battle continued to rage, as the living and the dead clashed in the ruins of Winterfell's courtyard. The Night King fell back, his ice sword weaving defensive patterns as he reassessed this unexpected development. "You resist the transformation," he said, his mental voice carrying a note of grudging respect. "Impressive, but resistance is not victory, young dragon. I have eternity to wear down your defenses while you have only the brief span of a mortal life." "Then I'd better make it count," Jon replied, and launched himself forward in a final desperate assault. The two combatants came together in a flurry of strikes and parries that would have been too fast for mortal eyes to follow. Ice and fire clashed again and again, each impact sending waves of conflicting energy through the throne room. The carved figures in the ice throne seemed to writhe and twist, as though the battle was somehow affecting their eternal torment. Jon could feel his strength beginning to fail again, but he pushed through the exhaustion, drawing on reserves he didn't know he possessed. The white fire around Longclaw flickered and wavered, but it didn't die. Instead, it seemed to be learning, adapting to the Night King's attacks, just as the creature had adapted to theirs. A particularly vicious exchange left both fighters breathing hard, or in the Night King's case, going through the motions of breathing despite having no need for air. Jon's armor was cracked and frost-covered, while the Night King's ice armor showed several deep gouges where Longclaw's fire had bitten deep. "You fight well for a mortal," the Night King admitted, his sword held in a guard position. "But you cannot win, even if you somehow manage to destroy this form. I will simply return in another. I am winter itself, eternal, inevitable, patient beyond your comprehension." "Maybe," Jon replied, his own blade held ready. "But I don't have to destroy you forever. I just have to stop you here, now, long enough for my people to survive." The Night King's laugh was like the sound of icebergs calving into the sea. "Survive for what?" "A few more years of warmth, before the next long night comes. You delay the inevitable, nothing more." "Sometimes that's enough," Jon said simply. "Sometimes buying time for the people you love is all you can do." He could sense movement beyond the ice maze. The battle in the courtyard was reaching its climax. The dragons were still fighting, their flames creating pockets of resistance against the endless tide of whites. But they were tiring, their fire growing weaker with each breath. Soon they would fall, and with them would go the last hope of victory. Unless Jon could find a way to end this quickly. The Night King seemed to sense his thoughts. "Yes, your dragons are failing. Your armies are being overwhelmed. Your friends and loved ones are dying, while you waste time on futile gestures of defiance. Surrender now, and I will make their end swift." "Never," Jon snarled, and threw himself into one final desperate attack. What followed was less a duel than a dance of destruction. Two beings of immense power locked in combat that transcended the merely physical. Jon's fire magic flowed through Longclaw like liquid starlight, while the Night King's ice sword seemed to drink in the very concept of heat. Where their blades met, reality itself seemed to bend and twist, creating brief glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities. In one exchange, Jon saw what the world would look like if the Night King won. An endless winter, where the dead outnumbered the living, 1,000 to 1. Where the great cities of Westeros lay buried under miles of ice and snow. In another he glimpsed a future where fire consumed everything, where dragons ruled over a world of ash and cinder. But in between those extremes, in the brief moments when fire and ice achieved perfect balance, he saw something else, a world where both could exist, where the cycle of seasons continued as it had since the beginning of time, where life and death remained in their proper proportions. That was what he was fighting for. Jon realized, not the dominance of fire over ice or ice over fire, but the balance that allowed both to exist. The Night King represented winter eternal, just as the ancient Targaryen dragon had represented summer without end. Both were abominations, distortions of the natural order that needed to be corrected. With that understanding came a new kind of power, not the raw, consuming fire he had been wielding, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. The white flames around Longclaw began to change, taking on new properties that the Night King's ancient eyes recognized with growing alarm. "What are you doing?" the creature demanded, his ice sword moving in increasingly desperate patterns as he tried to penetrate Jon's defenses. "What I should have done from the beginning," Jon replied, his voice carrying a new note of authority. "Fighting balance with balance, order with order." The final exchange came without warning. The Night King, perhaps sensing that his advantage was slipping away, abandoned all pretense of defense and launched a killing strike, aimed directly at Jon's heart. But Jon was ready for it, had been preparing for this moment since the duel began. Longclaw met the ice sword in a clash that shattered every piece of ice in the throne room, including the throne itself. The carved figures of ancient victims were finally released from their torment, their forms dissolving into mist that was immediately swept away by the conflicting energies. The battle had raged for hours, and Jon's strength was failing. Every swing of Longclaw felt like lifting a mountain, his breath coming in ragged gasps that crystallized in the supernatural cold. The Night King showed no signs of fatigue, his ice sword moving with the same inhuman precision as when their duel began. Above them, the dragons roared in frustration. Barion's flames, which had seemed inexhaustible at the battle's start, were growing weaker. Ygritte and Viserion circled desperately, their fire unable to touch the Night King directly. Rhaegar dove again and again, but the ancient creature simply walked through dragon fire as if it were morning mist. "You cannot maintain this forever, young dragon," the Night King said, his mental voice carrying cold amusement. "Your fire burns bright, but all flames eventually consume their fuel." From beyond the ice maze, Jon could hear the larger battle raging. Daenerys' voice cut through the chaos as she rallied the defenders, Dark Sister flashing in her hands. Thoros of Myr stood atop burning corpses, his flaming sword cutting down whites. But even the Red Priest's flames were dimming. Davos coordinated the archers near the keep, their dragonglass arrows running dangerously low. "The eastern wall is failing," Daenerys shouted. "We can't hold them much longer." The Night King pressed his advantage, his blade slipping past Jon's guard to trace frost across his ribs. "Your loved ones cry out in their final moments. Accept the transformation I offer, and I will spare those you care about." "Never," Jon snarled, but the word came out weaker than intended. Jon stumbled, nearly falling as exhaustion overwhelmed him. Through gaps in the ice maze, he saw the courtyard being overrun. The defenders were being pushed back on all sides, their positions crumbling under endless waves of whites. In that moment of near defeat, a memory surfaced. Thoros' words from long ago, spoken over a campfire when the Red Priest was deep in his cups. "Fire shows you truth, lad, but never the whole of it. The brightest flame casts the deepest shadow, and in that shadow, the real truth often hides." Jon forced himself to look at the Night King with new eyes, not as an enemy to defeat but as a puzzle to solve. His fire-enhanced vision began to perceive something he had missed before. Deep within the Night King's chest, behind ice armor and frozen flesh, something pulsed with dark rhythm. It was the source of everything. The reanimation of the dead, the supernatural cold, the corruption and transformation. "The heart," Jon whispered, understanding flooding through him. "It's all in the heart." The Night King's eyes widened with genuine surprise. "What did you say?" Jon drew on reserves he didn't know he possessed. Not physical strength, but something deeper. The connections he had forged, the bonds of love and loyalty that tied him to the living world. Every person who had believed in him, every life he had touched, all of it flowed into him. "Fire shows you truth," Jon said, rising to his feet with Longclaw blazing brighter than ever. "And the truth is, you're not invincible. You're just a man who made a terrible choice." The Night King's composure cracked. "Impossible? I am winter itself. I am the end of all things." "No," Jon replied with absolute conviction. "You're a heart of darkness wrapped in ice and shadow, and hearts can be stopped." The final exchange lasted only seconds. The Night King struck with winter's fury, his ice sword moving faster than thought. But Jon was no longer fighting with just his own strength. He fought with the strength of everyone who had chosen hope over despair, life over death. Longclaw moved like a comet, trailing white fire. The Night King's blade met it halfway, and Jon did something unexpected. He let the ice sword's momentum carry it past his guard, accepting a wound that scraped frost across his ribs. The Night King was overextended for just a fraction of a second. That was all Jon needed. Longclaw's point found the gap in the ice armor, punching through shadow and ancient flesh to find the heart of darkness that beat at the Night King's core. The Valyrian steel, wreathed in white fire and empowered by the collective will of the living, pierced the source of 8,000 years of winter. The Night King's scream shattered every remaining piece of ice, a sound of pure agony that tore holes in reality itself. His armor began to crack and splinter, revealing the withered form beneath, not terrible majesty, but something pitifully human. 8,000 years, the Night King gasped, his mental voice fading. And you end it with a single thrust. Not just me, Jon whispered. All of us. Everyone who chose to stand and fight. The Night King's form dissolved, ice and shadow breaking apart like morning mist. His terrible blue eyes remained fixed on Jon's face until the very end. This is not the end, he whispered. Winter always returns. Then he exploded into ice crystals, and shadow that swirled around the ruined throne room before being swept away by impossible winds. The darkness at his heart scattered like smoke, its power broken forever. Silence fell. Jon stood alone in the ruins, staring at where the Night King had been. Around him, the ice maze collapsed as supernatural cold faded. But his attention was drawn to sounds from beyond, sounds of victory. Across the battlefield, the army of whites crumbled to dust, their animating force severed. White walkers shattered like ice sculptures, dissolving into mist. The unnatural winter broke, and Jon felt the temperature rising. Daenerys' voice carried across the ruins, filled with relief and joy. "Where are you?" "Here," he called back, voice cracking with exhaustion. "I'm here." She found him moments later, picking through the collapsed maze with Dark Sister in hand. Her violet eyes were wide with amazement at the destruction around them. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," Jon confirmed, letting Longclaw's flames finally die. The Night King is gone. His army is destroyed. The long night is ending. Daenerys threw her arms around him, and Jon held her close, drawing strength from her warmth. Around them, celebration rose from the battlefield as survivors realized they had won the impossible. But Jon couldn't forget the Night King's final words. Winter always returns. It was a warning that this victory was only temporary. Somewhere the seeds of the next long night were already being planted. But that was a problem for another day. For now, they had won. The realm would survive to see another spring. The dragons circled overhead, their roars no longer cries of frustration, but songs of triumph. The heart of darkness had been pierced, and the light had won. The silence that followed the Night King's destruction was profound, almost sacred. For the first time in hours, no clash of steel rang across the courtyard. No roars of dragons echoed from above. No screams of the dying pierced the air. The supernatural winter that had gripped Winterfell was breaking, and with it came something the survivors had almost forgotten. The gentle warmth of natural sunlight breaking through the clouds. Jon stood swaying in the ruins of the ice throne room, Longclaw hanging loose in his grip. The white fire that had wreathed the blade throughout the battle was gone, leaving only Valyrian steel that gleamed with an inner light that seemed somehow different than before. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. "Jon," Daenerys said softly, her hand touching his arm. "Jon, you need to—" He collapsed before she could finish the sentence, his knees buckling as the last of his strength finally gave out. Daenerys caught him as he fell, her arms going around him as they both sank to the frozen ground. His breathing was shallow, labored, and she could feel how much the fire magic had cost him. His body was burning with fever despite the cold, and she could see new lines etched around his eyes as if years had been carved away in the space of hours. "I'm here," she whispered, cradling his head in her lap. "I'm here, and it's over. You did it, Jon. You saved us all." Around them, the ice maze continued to collapse, the supernatural cold that had held it together fading with each passing moment. Through the gaps, they could see the courtyard of Winterfell, where an impossible sight was unfolding. The army of whites that had seemed endless, unstoppable, was simply gone. Not destroyed in the conventional sense, but dissolved, their forms crumbling to dust that was quickly scattered by the wind. The White Walkers, those ancient lieutenants who had served their master for millennia, had shattered like sculptures of ice the moment Longclaw pierced the Night King's heart. Their fragments melted and ran away in rivulets of water that steamed in the warming air. My lord, Davos's voice carried across the ruins, rough with emotion and relief. My lord, where are you? Here, Daenerys called back, her voice cracking. We're here. The first to reach them was Thoros of Myr, his flaming sword finally extinguished, but his eyes still bright with the fire of victory. The Red Priest took one look at Jon's condition and immediately knelt beside them, his weathered hands moving to check for injuries. He's alive, Thoros said after a moment, relief evident in his voice. Exhausted, drained, but alive. The fire magic took much from him, but not everything. He'll recover, given time. Davos arrived next, his weathered face creased with concern as he looked down at Jon's still form. He'll live, Daenerys said firmly, as much to convince herself as the others. He has to. But it was the arrival of the Stark family that truly marked the end of the battle. Ned came first, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of pride and concern as he saw his son, his nephew, but son in every way that mattered, lying unconscious in the ruins of what had been the Night King's throne room. Behind him came Arya, her face streaked with soot and blood, but her eyes bright with fierce joy. Sansa followed, her usual composure cracked by relief and exhaustion. And finally Robb, his sword still in his hand and his armor dented from the battle, but very much alive. Jon, Ned breathed, dropping to his knees beside his son. My boy. He did it, Arya said, her voice filled with wonder. He actually did it. He killed the Night King. Look around you, Sansa added, gesturing to the dissolving ice maze. The warming air, the complete absence of any supernatural threat. The long night is over. After 8,000 years, it's finally over. As if summoned by her words, the dragons descended from the sky. Aerion landed first, his massive form shaking the ground as he folded his wings. The great black dragon's eyes, usually fierce and predatory, were filled with something that looked almost like reverence as he gazed at his fallen rider. Ygritte, Viserion, and Rhaegar followed, forming a protective circle around the small group of humans. From the courtyard beyond, the sound of voices began to rise. Not cries of battle or screams of terror, but something else entirely: cheers, shouts of victory, the sound of people who had expected to die but found themselves miraculously alive. The Fireborn King, someone shouted from the distance. Hail the Fireborn King! The Wolf Dragon, another voice added. He who ended the long night. The cheers spread like wildfire through the ranks of the survivors, growing louder and more fervent with each passing moment. Soldiers who had fought beside Jon, nobles who had sworn their swords to his cause, common folk who had found refuge behind Winterfell's walls, all of them took up the cry. Fireborn King, Wolf Dragon, the Night's End. Ned's face was troubled as he listened to the cheers. They see him as something more than human now, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the celebration. A legend made flesh, isn't he? Arya asked, her gray eyes studying Jon's still form. Look what he just did, father. He faced the Night King in single combat, and won. He ended 8,000 years of winter with a single sword thrust. How is that not the stuff of legends? Because legends aren't real people, Sansa said softly. They don't collapse from exhaustion, they don't bleed or hurt or pay prices for their power, but Jon does. He's still our brother, our family, no matter what else he might be. Robb knelt beside Ned, his hand reaching out to touch Jon's shoulder. He's changed, he said, and there was something like sadness in his voice. I can see it, even with him unconscious. There's something different about him now, something that wasn't there before. It was true. Even in unconsciousness, Jon radiated a presence that was hard to define, but impossible to ignore. The air around him seemed to shimmer slightly, as if heated by invisible flames. His skin had taken on a faint luminescence that was barely perceptible, but definitely there. Most telling of all, his hair, once the deep brown of the Starks, now showed streaks of silver gold that caught the light like spun metal. The fire magic changed him, Thoros confirmed, his voice heavy with knowledge and regret. It always does, to those who wield it at this level. The power that let him face the Night King as an equal, it comes with a price. It always comes with a price. What kind of price? Daenerys demanded, her violet eyes flashing with sudden fear. His humanity, the Red Priest said simply. Not all of it. Not yet. But but pieces of it burned away to fuel the magic. He's still Jon Snow, still the man you love, but he's also something more now. And with each use of that power, more of the man will be consumed by the legend. The cheers from the courtyard were growing louder, more organized. Someone had started a chant that was spreading through the ranks. Fireborn, Fireborn. They'll want to crown him, Ned said quietly, not just as king in the north, but as something greater. The man who ended the long night, who saved the world from eternal winter. They'll want to make him into a god, and he'll hate every moment of it. Oryu added with a small smile, you know how he feels about titles and ceremony. As if summoned by their words, Jon's eyes fluttered open. For a moment they seemed to glow with inner fire, but then the light faded, and they were just gray eyes. Tired, pained, but undeniably alive. Dany, he whispered, his voice hoarse from the battle. I'm here, she replied, her hand stroking his hair. We're all here. It's over, Jon. The Night King is dead. His army is gone. You did it. Jon tried to sit up, but Daenerys gently pressed him back down. Easy, she said. You've been through hell. Just rest for a moment. The others? Jon asked. Thoros, Davos, my family, all alive, Ned assured him, his voice thick with emotion. Thanks to you, we're all alive. Jon's eyes closed again, but not in unconsciousness this time. It was relief, pure and simple. I thought I might not make it. The fire magic, it was burning through me so fast. I could feel pieces of myself disappearing with each spell. But you held on, Daenerys said. You found a way to win without losing yourself completely. Jon opened his eyes and looked at her, and for a moment his expression was troubled. Did I? He asked quietly. I can feel it, Dany. The change. I'm not the same person who walked into that ice maze. You're still you, she insisted. You're still the man I fell in love with, the man who puts duty before desire, who protects the innocent no matter the cost to himself. Am I? Jon's voice was barely a whisper now, meant only for her ears. In those final moments, when I was fighting the Night King, I heard her voice. Whose voice? Lyanna's, Jon said, his eyes distant with memory. My mother's voice speaking to me through the flames. She was guiding me, showing me what I needed to do. She told me that this was my destiny, that I was born to end the long night. But she also warned me about the price. Daenerys felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fading winter. What price? The more I use this power, the more I become like them, like the ancient Targaryens, who thought themselves gods, like Aegon, the Conqueror, who burned his enemies to ash and called it justice, like Morgott the Cruel, who ruled through fear and fire. Jon's hand found hers, squeezing gently. She said that power like this changes you, makes you see people as pieces on a board instead of living beings with hopes and dreams and fears. Then don't use it, Daenerys said simply. The Night King is dead. The long night is over. You don't need that power anymore. Jon's smile was sad. Do you really think it's that simple? Listen to them, Dany. He gestured weakly toward the courtyard, where the chanting had grown even louder. They're not cheering for Jon Snow anymore. They're cheering for the Fireborn King, the Wolf Dragon, the man who ended winter itself. How long before they expect me to solve every problem with fire and magic? How long before I start thinking that's the answer to everything? The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. Already, Jon could sense the change in how people looked at him. Even his own family, who had known him since childhood, regarded him with a mixture of love and awe that hadn't been there before. He was still their Jon, but he was also something more, and something less. We'll figure it out, Daenerys said firmly. Together, whatever comes next, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together. Together, Jon agreed, and for the first time since waking, his smile was genuine. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. A group of lords and knights was making their way through the ruins of the ice maze, led by Lord Commander Mormont of the Night's Watch. Their faces were filled with reverence and something approaching religious awe. Your Grace, Mormont said, dropping to one knee before Jon. The realm owes you a debt that can never be repaid. You have saved us all. Rise, Lord Commander, Jon said, struggling to sit up despite Daenerys' protests. We all fought together. The victory belongs to everyone who stood against the darkness. But you struck the killing blow, Mormont insisted. You faced the Night King in single combat and emerged victorious. The songs will remember this day for 1,000 years, and your name will be spoken with the same reverence as Azor Ahai himself. Jon winced at the comparison. Azor Ahai, the legendary hero who had ended the first long night, had become more myth than man in the telling. Was that to be his fate as well? To be transformed from a person into a symbol, from a man into a legend? "Help me up," he said to Daenerys, who reluctantly assisted him in getting to his feet. His legs were still unsteady, but he managed to stand without falling. The moment he rose, the cheering from the courtyard reached a crescendo. "Fireborn King! Fireborn King!" Jon looked out, over the ruins of the ice maze, toward the courtyard where hundreds of survivors had gathered. They were looking at him with faces full of hope and gratitude, and something that made him deeply uncomfortable: worship. "This is what you were afraid of," Ned said quietly, coming to stand beside his son. "This is why you never wanted to be king." "I'm not their god," Jon replied, his voice barely audible over the cheering. "I'm just a man who did what needed to be done." "But to them, you're the man who ended the long night," Arya pointed out. "The man who saved the world. Whether you like it or not, you're a legend now." Jon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. The Night King was dead, the long night was over, but his trials were far from finished. In some ways, they were just beginning. The dawn was breaking over Winterfell, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised better days ahead. But Jon knew that with the dawn came new challenges, new responsibilities, new prices to be paid for the power he had wielded. He had saved the world, but at what cost to his soul? Only time would tell.